Yeah. I get asked all the time how to say my name, and I just I'm okay with the anglicized version of it, which is for better.
That would be
Fellipe do Vale. Yeah.
Fellipe.
Yeah.
And how would you say it
in Portuguese? Fellipe do Vale.
Fellipe do Vale.
Yeah.
Fellipe do Vale.
Yeah. Which is great pronunciation. That's pretty good. It's but I had one time somebody say to me, "Can I just call you Phil?" I was like, "No." At least try. Welcome to Foreword, a TEDS faculty podcast. I'm Fellipe do Vale.
And I'm Madison Pierce.
Today we have the privilege of interviewing Dr. Manuel Rauchholz, who is Associate Professor of Anthropology and Intercultural Studies here at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. Well, we're going to find out that Manuel's been in a lot of different places throughout his life, but for us, a portion of that time, he was a THM student here, where before completing further graduate work at the University of Heidelberg, where he studied cultural anthropology. And then he has been here for how many years now?
3 years.
So he's been with us at TEDS for 3 years. And it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
That's wonderful. Which means that neither of us had you as a professor. You would have come since then. Right. So that's one of the special things. I've really enjoyed getting to know you since I've been here on faculty. So we'll give our audience an opportunity to do that too. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Where did you grow up and how did you get back here to TEDS?
Well, I was born in 1972 in Germany. My parents were working as missionaries at the time in Micronesia. It's a small island region in the Western Pacific. Basically between the Philippines and Hawaii, but still north of the equator. And my mother's American, my dad is German. And so they were on a visit of what they call a furlough in Germany when I was born. I have 3 older sisters and a younger brother. So being raised, I was only basically born in Germany. All my siblings were not born in Germany. They were born in Micronesia. So growing up as a child, I kind of always envied that I had place of birth Germany, and they had all these more exotic islands where they were born.
Yeah.
But so I spent most of my childhood years in Micronesia in the islands of Chuuk. They're famously known as today as a dive spot, one of the premier dive spots today, because the Japanese Navy had one of their main hubs there during World War II, and the Americans took revenge on Pearl Harbor and threw down probably 10 times the amount of bombs that the Japanese did on Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
And so there are all these wrecks lying scattered across the lagoon that people like to come and visit just to go in for a dive.
Okay.
Wow.
Yeah, so that's these small islands are where we grew up. I spent my first 5 years there. Then my dad continued his studies at Wheaton College. So I did kindergarten and first grade in Glen Ellen. And then did second grade in Germany. And then we went back to Micronesia, where I went to grades 3 to 7, and then moved on to Japan, went to a German school there, transitioned to the German school system, then to Germany for 2 years, and then back to Japan for the final 3 years of high school.
Wow.
So I think I changed schools 7 times up till graduation from 13th grade. So in the German high school or academic high school system, we had a 13-year system. So how did I get to know TEDS? So as I was a student of theology in Germany, I was always planning from the beginning to study abroad overseas for at least 1 year. There are 2 ways to do that, either through scholarship programs, some exchange programs, or also through what I might call like a German Pell Grant, so funding from the German government, because they really want to encourage students to go overseas. And so in this process, I was at Tübingen, and that's when I became acquainted with Paul Hiebert, not him personally, but some of his writings.
Oh, wow.
And I thought, okay, where is he right now? And he's at Trinity, and because I always had an interest in anthropology, and he was a theologian and an anthropologist, I thought it might be interesting just to study with him for a while. And so I actually turned down a full scholarship at Princeton Seminary for a year, and came to Trinity instead.
Yeah. Take that, Princeton.
Princeton's a good school. It's a great school. Yeah. But there would have not been anything considerably different studying theology there than from studying theology in Tübingen or Heidelberg. Right. So the unique component, thing I was looking for was engaging with a theologian who was also anthropologically versed. Because I found studying theology in Germany, while there are many great and fascinating and brilliant theologians, one thing I find theology there lacks until today, it is, kind of developed in its own cocoon, right? Where people assume that the theology they're doing is universal, it's applicable to all humankind. But I felt many of the questions they were asking were not questions I would ever ask, not people in Japan would ever ask, or people in the Pacific would ever ask. So these were like irrelevant questions. But I was forced to deal with them, which is okay as a student. But I thought if I can have some independence from that way of thinking and kind of develop some of my own questions and seek answers to some of the questions I have and find people that are willing to engage with me with the questions that I have. Right. And I think that is what I found here at Trinity with Paul Hiebert in the missions department.
Wonderful.
And I think that is also where anthropology brought, a different perspective into the picture for me as a graduate student at the time.
Yeah. Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah, it's lovely. It sounds like your upbringing, your family, your experiences shaped quite a bit of how the direction you wanted to take your studies. And I imagine, you still have quite an international family at the moment. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your current ministries and your family?
Yeah, so my wife, Miham, is a native South Korean. Her parents moved to Germany in the 1970s. Her dad in particular to study theology in Münster. And the mom came through an exchange program as a military nurse. So she was a ranked officer and worked in a military hospital in Germany. So the husband said, Germany's good in theology. I'm a theologian, pastor. I can do graduate work here. So my wife is ethnically Korean, but actually spent more years in Germany in her childhood and later on in life than I have. I have a German passport. But she's culturally the more German, and maybe feels overall more comfortable in a German setting than I probably do. But she's ethnically Korean, right?
Wow.
And so we often get to hear this when we're in South Korea or elsewhere. Her friends tell her, "You're so German, but your husband, we kind of, get along better with him." But so she spent much of her childhood in Germany. Then the family moved back to South Korea. And then the father maintained, or had her and her sister maintain, speaking German at home because he didn't want them to lose the language. And so they then, after completing their college education in South Korea, they came to Germany for graduate studies, both in theology, and then did their PhDs in Tübingen, my wife, and then her sister in Heidelberg. And so, we're a multi-ethnic family, basically. But looks can deceive or be deceiving because culturally I would, position myself closer to the Asian context or Pacific, while she might be more situated in the European context. So
it's worth getting to know people.
Exactly. Absolutely. It's worth getting to know people and to look kind of beyond just the outward appearance.
I wonder, you've already painted a really excellent picture and helped us to understand what kind of led you toward anthropology. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about how your experience led you to your particular work, because most of your work has been focusing on Micronesia. So what kind of led you to make those choices?
That's a good question. So first of all, the choice to go back to Micronesia, some questions can be answered quite simply. So for the one hand, I had been thinking of actually doing research in Russia. I've been to Russia in the 1990s after the fall of communism.
Wow.
And I thought this would be a very exciting place to do ethnographic fieldwork. But then I had an accident. I had to then make sure that I still finished my studies within a certain time frame because I had to take like semesters off for the healing process. In the meantime, got involved with Miham, getting married, etc. And so then I realized, it's going to take too much time then for me to go to Russia, even though my wife and I really open. Decided to go there. But step one would be learning Russian, and step two would probably learning another ethnic minority language.
Okay.
And so, given all these time constraints, I figured in the end, okay, it might be valuable to just go back to Micronesia and do my fieldwork there for my doctoral dissertation, because I speak the language. It used to be my first language as a kid growing up. And, going deeper in one ethnic group will also help you translate all of that, what you learn, to other societies. So some people might view that as being, he just, did the studies in one ethnic group, and see that as a negative. But there's also a positive to it, as Paul Hiebert once said. You can look at many societies on a shallow level, or you can just dig very deeply, and then from there you get a different perspective. That you can also translate to other social and cultural contexts, right? So basically, that is the approach. Guiding those decisions, and second, the nice thing about say Micronesia is we're dealing with in a way a kind of a laboratory type situation. It's smaller populations, geographically limited to smaller spaces. So if you want to study politics, it's easy because you can just get in a car or walk 10 minutes and you'll be at the governor's office. You walk another 2 minutes, you're at Department of Education. So all of these government offices are basically in a very small microcosm. So the pathways to different people are relatively short. Yes, people are highly mobile, right? So half the population of Micronesia lives overseas, in the US, Hawaii, and Guam. But nevertheless, you can actually dig in quite deep and get a very broad and deep view of many aspects of what it means to be human, a person, a Christian, a politician, a mother, father, child, kind of like almost like a laboratory situation, right? So that's, I think, one reason why I have chosen to just, focus on one ethnic group, and then the or not just one ethnic group, but one region. And a second component is probably this. This ties into some of your questions. Why anthropology? Why in this region? As an anthropologist, I remember a convention I was attending in 2012 in Portland, Oregon, where we as Pacific anthropologists had invited citizens from the Pacific who lived in the Western U.S. to just join our academic conference. And so we had like what they call a brown bag lunch, where we kind of met with representatives from Samoa, Fiji, Micronesia, and different parts of the Pacific. And it was interesting to listen to the people ask and question the anthropologists and ask them, guys, where are you? I mean, you're doing all this research on our ethnic groups. You kind of see where the troubles are economically, politically, all the social ills. But, your idea of reverse anthropology or of, supporting the community that nurtured your academic career is interpreted as, I sent them back a copy of my book. It's in their libraries where the termites are eating them. But how are you with your knowledge and your expertise helping our societies and communities develop? Right? So I thought, okay, that's a very valid point. Right? In America, in Germany, in Europe, we have tons of sociologists, anthropologists that study our culture, that study the economy. So we can make projections, plan, develop our society. But in many of these places, more remote places, a cultural anthropologist might be the only social scientist, who is on deck. And so then in the course of time, I was, always in contact, of course, with people in government and church that have asked, can you maybe come back and help us in education and get more involved? So that's kind of what has pretty much kept me more connected. And then it's also about people. I would probably also argue I feel very much at home there. It's a place I grew up. I felt very comfortable in Europe, I would say. But then after going back and working there professionally, that just added a different layer of connectivity, I would say, to the people, to the places.
Right.
So I hope that answered that question.
Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely it does.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Well, I love what you said, that it seems as though your vision for anthropology has a goal that it must be geared toward. You study the people and the things that they're doing, but you do it with a view to help them somehow, or to cast light on the, the ins and outs of the community and what makes it so valuable and special and distinct. And I find that incredibly valuable, not just for me, but for our community here at TEDS, which leads me to want to ask, I think it's wonderful that we have an anthropologist on faculty. What do you think that your discipline and your research can contribute to a place like this, like a seminary where we're training pastors and theologians and counselors? What is it that your discipline can offer to this particular community, and how does it enrich it? Because surely it does.
Yeah.
I think the main contribution is really in its anthropocentric focus.
Yeah.
So in theology, we learn to study God, the Word of God, how God thinks about Himself, about humans, et cetera, and how He has acted in this world through history and time. We look at the effects of Christianity in church history, et cetera, et cetera. But in cultural anthropology, it's really about incarnation, to be honest. The one guiding principle in cultural anthropology is, the going native principle, or, to participate in another ethnic group's, a social group's livelihood, and kind of become as much as you can one of them.
Yeah.
And anthropologists may not be happy if I mention this, but basically we have that modeled in the incarnation of Jesus Christ, right? Where Paul in his theology says, I have become a Greek for the Greek, become a Jew for the Jews, and I have become everything for everyone. So, and part of that process of immersing yourself into a community that is not your native community and and there's a second point, trying to understand, who these people are, why they do what they do. To not just say, in the Kantian way, there's an absolute form of reason, and everything that does not fit that logic is unreasonable, right? No, there is a clear sense of reasoning, logic behind the decisions people make. It's just that their decisions are being guided by different principles, different values, and different expectations and perspectives they have on their life and what they would like to see as an outcome for their life, right? And this is something, that I, thought in when I was studying theology in Germany was kind of on the weak side, where I think anthropology can make a contribution to theologians to start thinking outside of their own box, and in a way be Christ-like and try and model incarnation, right? And that often gets lost when we are kind of confined to our ivory tower of theology, the books, the libraries. We lose kind of contact to the people. And so I think this would be maybe the main contribution. So if I want to write a book in theology, I go to my library and I start pulling out books. If I want to write a book in cultural anthropology, I have to find people, right? Pull them out of wherever they are, but then they might not be there where I expect them to be in the community. So, I planned some projects, okay, I'm going to meet these people. Oh, grandma was missing her grandchildren. She flew off to the US. So all of these things, it's a highly mobile set of data you're dealing with.
That's right.
That is alive. And so that's basically the part I really enjoy about it. But it involves a lot more work, and it involves the component of, death to yourself, giving up of yourself. So this is, I think, something people often overlook. But when you immerse yourself in a different culture and try and live with people, live amongst people that are different from yourself, in order to really feel comfortable and for them to feel comfortable in your presence. You have to give up some of your own nationalistic thinking, your own ideologies. And it's a painful process because it's what you identify yourself with, what things you're proud of. I'm Korean. We're really proud of what we've become as a nation, or German, or American. Many Americans I experience, they say, in Micronesia, if they only did things the way we do it in America, they would be as wealthy as we are, they'd be as educated as we are, et cetera, et cetera. But is that really the goal that the people have locally? So I think this is the contribution of anthropology, is to begin with that step of trying to understand. And that process of understanding is achieved best through immersion. And that immersion process includes losing part of yourself. And that's painful. Just my, teenage daughter recently said, it's really painful for me now going back to Germany because I've become so different from living in different places now. But in order to really feel comfortable here and embedded, I'm going to have to give up some things that I worked hard to become.
Yeah.
Right. Or some things that I value, but they're not really valued in the German context, right? Of communication, for example, or vice versa. So it is very challenging. Yeah. But I think a necessary process for growth and to increase understanding between, the church also, the nations, people amongst each other.
Yeah.
You highlighted, Fellipe, the way that Manuel's experience with the Micronesian people allowed him to shed light on the beauty. But it's also the case that a lot of your work has actually focused on some of the more difficult aspects of Micronesian culture, including trafficking and exploitation or sexual violence. Could you tell us a little bit about some of the themes in your work?
Yeah.
I don't know if themes is the best way of putting that.
Themes is a good way to put it. So I think, every society has values that kind of guide people's decision-making that are like, primary values that guide people's decision-making.
Yeah.
And I forget who mentioned this, but every unguarded, it may have been Bonhoeffer, every unguarded strength quickly becomes a weakness, right? And so in communities like in Micronesia, where one of the principles of family life is being of one mind, being of one heart, working together, having everything together, sharing things together, right? If I use the Chuukese terms, it's like thing and, use everything together.
Yeah.
So it can be a wonderful experience if, you cannot pay for your education, but the whole family puts together the money and sends off their brightest mind to go off to college. Right? Because they share everything together. Same in an African community. I was, encountered an African theologian who was questioned by his German counterparts. Why are you driving such a shabby car? You're earning a professor's salary here now, et cetera, et cetera. And it's, and he says, there's one thing you don't understand. My whole family did not eat meat. Like I'm talking about 20 or 30 people in my extended family. They would only eat meat once a week in Kenya. They're taxi drivers, they're day laborers, etc. And when they saw the potential I had, they said, okay, we got to get this guy through. So they cut the meat off their menu for the 3 or 4 years I went to college.
Oh, wow.
Right? That's what got me the scholarship to come to Germany and get a PhD scholarship.
Wow.
Now, what I am doing is I am helping my brothers, my cousins' kids go to school, high school, college, etc. So I'm just giving back and showing my gratitude to the rest of my family, right? And in America, everything is about, by the time a kid turns 18, get out of the house, you start paying, you don't get any tax deductibles for your kids when they're 17 or turn 17 that year, et cetera. That's like a whole different view on family. But it also points me to the weakness. Namely, if you have everything together, there are certain boundaries that people might not be as mindful to keep, or that are more easily transgressed, right? Based on the hierarchy and obligations to people to share everything together. So it might begin with wife sharing. If in say the pre-Christian forms of, say, Micronesian culture, if, my wife is not available, then maybe her sister will be available. Yeah. But that's a model of sharing that has kind of been built into the culture and the reasoning. Because I, as a husband, man, would not want another male to come in between. And the family of the wife will be very encouraging of that because they would like the families to stay together. So you also share your spouses, right? So I have friends who said, a young woman gets married and tells her best friend, who's like hierarchically at the same level, says, my husband is your husband. In case you ever, she was still single, like a 22-year-old or 23-year-old, if you ever need a guy, you don't have to go somewhere else. Just, here, my husband is available. But then on the other hand, you will see some families where those that are better off or in the hierarchy higher up, they will collect a group of, younger couples into a household, even in the US or in Guam or wherever they might be living or back home. And then this might then provide opportunity for the male who is higher up in the hierarchy to access the younger females, sexually. Or many nations face this, that, governments are slow to pay out their Pell Grant to their students, or the college support. So you have all these female students going to college. They're maybe working at McDonald's in Guam, right? And so they can't pay their bills. They talk to the manager, hey, can I get like some money up front? Can I get my advance pay or something? So then they accumulate some debt, and there's a debt in the family. They have to provide because they're working. They're going to provide all this.
Yeah.
But then eventually the McDonald's manager will say, hey guys, can you pay me back the $1,000? Oh, no, I can't. Well, then, we'll have to figure something out, how you can repay. So then he'll say, I have some friends, maybe you can help me out with my friends. And the next thing you know it, this girl going to college in Guam is having sex with the friends of the McDonald's manager who's collecting money for it, right? Mm-hmm. And he's trafficking his own employees, right? Or the same thing happening, at a university in Papua New Guinea, Goroka, where the business people who have money, they come to the university because they want the more educated women. The college students, the males, they won't have access, but then they'll start paying them because they know the government is late in making these payments, and they can't send money from their relatives. Internet is not working, etc. Banking system, it's a very rural, dispersed country. Yeah. So that creates these pools of dependent or, women, for example, that are in trouble.
Yeah.
And so then the business community takes advantage of that. And then the college guys, they don't have access to the college girls because they're kind of, trafficked upwards. And so they then go to the high school, right? And then do that thing there because they're in college. So then they're like the attractive guys up there. So are there other ways where for example, maybe intimate violence or violence against members of the same family might not be viewed as being as bad because these boundaries of abuse of a body and use of a body, these boundaries might be broader or narrower. Right? So when do you call the use of a body abuse?
Yeah.
And we have to be very self-critical here in America too, because if you work for an employer, we say here they own you because they're paying for your time. How much of your time do they buy? You're working 100 hours a week. Do you still see your children? Do you still have dinners with them, dinner time with them, et cetera, et cetera? And we forget that we are, in essence, bought, or our time is bought, right? And our mind, our intellectual abilities, our social skills are being used, maybe not in our homes, but elsewhere for the purpose of money. I'll give an example. I had an employee in Micronesia, was waiting for a meeting. He was walking down the island path, and we had already made face contact. And then an uncle was coming down the path. They met on the path. And he kind of looks up one more time, turns around and leaves. Like this was like at 2 p.m. We're planning to have a meeting. He's our employee. We have face contact. Who owns who? Who controls a human being? Who can tell a person what to do, and who does that person belong to? And how are the allegiances structured? Is it the well-being of the family or the individual? And in this case, it's a conflict. He has to make a decision. Do I obey my uncle, who I always belong to, or do I obey my employer and my fellow employees who are waiting for me to have this meeting right now? Right? And so the uncle just couldn't find another young man to go fishing with him. So he said, we're going fishing.
Oh my goodness.
Goodbye. Off he went, right? And so in the same way, if an uncle will say to a daughter or to a boy, you're going to do this, you're going to do that. And it's for the greater well-being of the family, then it's for the greater well-being of the family. And so, people might instill that sense of achievement in these young people. And if that's the only way you were raised, like there's a nice book out called Modern Babylon, was written in the 90s, a researcher doing research amongst children in Thailand that are being trafficked out of their homes. Right. And so there's that Buddhist tradition and Confucian tradition where you're always obligated to your parents. Like you always owe them for having birthed you. Whoever came first before you is above you. They birthed you. You owe your life to them. So if you're a 2 or 3 or 4 year old and the family says, okay, you're going to go off with this man or with this boy or with this or that person, you're just going to do whatever the family expects of you. and the money you will get in return is contributing to the better whole of the family.
Yeah.
So if that is how you're socialized in your mindset,
right.
That is it'll make you feel good.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But there's a difference then with kids that are actually kidnapped, taken out of their homes, et cetera, and then exploited in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But so these are the kind of things I also try and look at is like the darker side of the human condition of society, and why people do what they do, and try and understand the cultural mechanisms or the values that actually drive this type of behavior.
Yeah.
Because it's easy for someone to come in and say, we have human rights.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And your government signed those.
Yeah.
Right? And but I don't see it happening here in the community.
Right.
And so for me as an anthropologist, it's not my job to come in and start prosecuting people, but it's to try and understand first what is driving this type of behavior, what is the mindset behind it, and what can we do to actually affect some kind of change for the well-being of these children. Right? There was a case of one missionary who was approached by actually the leadership of an island community because they said, the to-be chief, the man who was in line to be chief, has been sexually violating boy and girl children.
Yeah.
And if he could talk to the family and just ask them to tell them to stop. One of the elders then in the family of the abuser basically said, for you guys in the West, this is such an important issue. Mm-hmm. But for us, it's not. Mm-hmm. And this was a man of the church saying that. Yeah. So there are aspects of every culture where maybe the value of a child, the body of a child, is valued differently. And if we look back into our own history, we'll find we don't have to look far. Just look at the history of racism in America, et cetera, et cetera. There's a different value attached to different types of bodies, people of different ethnic groups, pay scales, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just a matter of scaling. How do we scale these things?
That's right. So that is so, wow, so much of what you said I found so interesting. Mm-hmm. It's interesting. I've read a bit about Pitcairn. It was one of those islands. It's a similar sort of situation, right? In terms of, and I find it so interesting, people who study places like that, places like you studied, because you're studying things that are unquestionably dark and difficult, but also a darkness which is complex, that requires nuance to understand.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And the temptation, I think, when, people who are not within that world, often the temptation might be just to build a wall between, being in that world and being outside of it. And like you said, like, it's just so easy to say, well, you have human rights, What's your recommendation for those of us who might not ever get the privilege of going to Micronesia, or in order not to build walls of separation, but to understand the complexity of the darkness, to appreciate it, and then to actually be agents of good? Do you have any ways that you've attempted to do that? Maybe ways the church can be agents of good in that direction as well?
Yeah. So if I speak for the case of Chuuk, you would probably see that the main agents of good are people coming out of the church. We have there what we call the Chuuk Women's Council. Mm-hmm. These are women from the Catholic and Protestant churches, leading women in both denominations that are providing safe houses of refuge and trying to raise the awareness, that violence against a spouse or a child should not be the main way to resolve a conflict or an argument, et cetera, et cetera. The problem is if you look at the history of these activities, a lot of their work they've had to do outside the church. Why is that? Because a lot of the funding that came for these types of programs came from the United States or other United Nations programs that exclude religion.
Okay.
But if religion is the only force that can actually affect change, but you exclude that force, so they have to end up doing their work, but outside the church. They're actually leading women even in their church, as the Catholic and Protestant church, but they're doing it kind of on the outside. So then people in the church will say, well, you're just doing this because you're getting these grants, right? So it's about the money then in the end, but not about the content. And that's something very difficult to explain to people in America who've kind of, polarized, religion and state and freedom and some of these themes.
Yeah.
So my argument would be, if you are dead serious about reducing violence, spousal or whatever, you need to work with any partner who shares the same values and wants this form of violence to end.
Collaboration.
So collaboration is needed. Regardless if you're a Muslim, a Christian, or whatever, if we can share that same goal in trying to make this world a better place, a more humane place, then it is important that we work together, right? And that does not mean I am giving up my faith or being disrespectful to the faith of the other. But the Christian faith or religion is a very powerful tool. In for people who experience violence and in overcoming trauma. And it can also be a tool in prevention. Because people then realize, wait a minute, I'm responsible to a God up in heaven or someone else. If I harm this child, I'll be made accountable, not to my peers here, but there's a God above me who says, hey, if you deceive or harm this child, it might be better for a millstone to be hung around your neck and you thrown into the sea. Right. So there's that element of teaching that can also come from the Christian faith to actually resolve and counter some of these attitudes that are, innate in any kind of community. So I'll give an example because many people think, okay, this kind of type of violence is happening anywhere in the world, but not in our backyard. There was a nice study done out of University of the Nazarene in San Diego. They did a study on human trafficking in San Diego, came out a couple of years ago. And, they found that only 10% of the victims of human trafficking in San Diego County, which is like border to Mexico, 90% of the victims are Americans. Only 10% are from Mexico or from elsewhere.
Wow.
Right. And it's an over $800 million a year industry. Just in San Diego County alone. So if you take those numbers from San Diego County and then you just extrapolate them on the state of Texas, just, the numbers is like tenfold. You're looking at an $8 billion business around sex trafficking in Texas.
$8 billion.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
That's if you take the numbers of this study in San Diego, right? San Diego County, and assume that you can, map them onto the state of Texas, for example.
Oh my.
Wow.
So that shows you that nobody's really safe. And many, churches might think, okay, it's not happening among us, but the way modern technology is being used, it's very easy to control people that way and access, boy or girl children, et cetera, et cetera. Just to get back to the issue of human trafficking, right? So it's a very sad thing, but it's the reality of life we often don't see. But that is out there. And here too, I would say, in the US, like 90% of the initiatives, providing services to victims of trafficking would be faith-based. Right? So government has little involvement, maybe in the prosecution, but not in the actual work revolving around helping victims.
Wow. Well, I could listen to you talk all day. And I wish you were around when I was a student because I'd probably take all your classes. But as we like to say here, that's just the foreword. If you'd like to learn more about Dr. Rauchholz, have a look at some of his publications in journals like the Asia Pacific Journal of Anthropology. You can watch a recent interview that he did with the Koinonia Network, or better yet, you can just come and study with him and take various of his intercultural studies courses here at TEDS. And I'm sure they're incredibly stimulating. I kind of wish I could take one of them myself.
Same.
Finally, we want to take a moment to thank our sedulous producer, Curtis Pierce, our sagacious graduate assistant, Lauren Januzik, and last but not least, to thank all you listeners and viewers for joining us. I'm Fellipe Dovale.
And I'm Madison Pierce. Thank you, Manuel. And thank you, everyone.
Foreword is a podcast hosted by faculty at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. The views expressed by the hosts and guests of Foreword do not necessarily represent the views of Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. You can subscribe to our newest episode on your preferred podcast app or at forewordpodcast.com. Be sure to follow us on Twitter and Facebook at Foreword Podcast to get updates and additional links to content. Trinity Evangelical Divinity School is located 25 miles north of Chicago with extension sites across the country and online. Trinity educates men and women to engage in God's redemptive work in the world by cultivating academic excellence, Christian faithfulness, and lifelong learning. You can find more information at teds.edu.